today, I'm really thankful for that setup from Rosie and from Sarah and Kelsey. I'm really excited to be here. We're in a transitional moment, in a moment, but a moment when we have a lot of strength, a lot of momentum, a lot of things to feel really good about. What I want to do today is to just walk through some of the needs of the moment, the best practices, the messages. This draws on faith in public life's longstanding road-tested principles, as well as the most up-to-date message research from the best people in the business who are doing focus groups and polls and things like that to see what lands and what doesn't. And then we'll talk about how to communicate in the media versus how to communicate in a congregation, and just some general principles of telling a simple, clear story. So with that, I'd like to dive into the slides. Please, yeah. Thanks, Rachel. So the number one need, the number one messaging imperative right now is to show confidence that the count is proceeding, that the will of the people is becoming known, and that democracy is functioning. We actually have authentic reason to feel like the process is working. It's about showing what we actually believe. It's not about putting on a face. We're trying to lead by example rather than to just try and spin people here. There's plenty to feel good about. A record number of people have voted. As the count goes on, it's getting clearer and clearer, and the end is in sight. Now, as we wait, what we need to do is help people feel that sense of belief and confidence that we have within ourselves. Rachel, next slide, please. And that means we need to avoid certain things. We're trying to be confident, and that means avoiding anxiety and paralysis. Because if people feel that, then it's harder to get folks to take action. How do we avoid anxiety and paralysis? We avoid apocalyptic language and things that might sound like scary scenarios. I hear the word once in a while, coup. I advise us to avoid repeating that word. I hear, scary terms like voter fraud. I would advise people to avoid those terms. That's what I mean by apocalyptic language. And the other thing we need to avoid is putting any candidate at the center of our story. This is a story about voters. We should be talking about democracy, and we should be talking about the will of the people rather than about Trump or Biden or any other candidate. This is a story about we the people. Next slide, please, Rachel. So I want to go through a couple of imperatives that are generally important and important for the moment, and then cut into a messaging formula that's going to work really well. So messaging imperatives right now, one is to lead with values. The first thing we say, whether we're talking to a congregation or a reporter, should be about the moral principles at stake. What motivates us? What makes this a faith issue? What makes this an issue of right and wrong? We go moral language first, values first. And we also want to weave our moral language throughout our messages. The more we sound uniquely like ourselves, and the less we sound like the pundits on television, the more we're meeting the needs of our people. Being voter-centric, as I said, the flip side of that is being candidate-centric. Being voter-centric means talking about voters, means talking about the popular will, the will of the people. This is the protagonist in our story. Us, we are the protagonist. We, the people, are the protagonist in our story. And we also want to provide people with information on the counting process. Right now, certified local election officials are counting every vote. We know from research that certified local election officials are trusted. Certified local election officials have high credibility. They help people have that confidence in the process that we're trying to instill. Rachel, next slide, please. A couple more messaging imperatives and a rule of thumb. We want to be forward-looking. Now is time for Americans to come together to tackle the challenges we face as a country. The more we're looking toward results and toward the future, and the less we're looking back at what happened in the past and what the last, what all the tumult of the last decade has meant. The less we're talking about the past, the better. We want to avoid repeating misinformation or attacks. Even if we want to push back against something, repeating it reinforces it. Like if I say, for instance, there's no voter fraud, what's not happening is voter fraud. I just said voter fraud twice. If I were publicly facing, I wouldn't have even said that word right now. When we're talking, we want to make sure to avoid repeating anyone's attacks on the democratic process. Now, this is an important rule of thumb. When in doubt, if you're not quite sure if what you're about to say in a sermon or an interview or any forum whatsoever is on the right note, just ask yourself, what emotion am I projecting and inspiring? Am I motivating people or am I demotivating people with this message? When in doubt, that's the question to ask yourself. Rachel, next slide, please. Now, part of being confident is being calm and patient. But when it comes to patience and being calm, we need to show rather than tell. I put this tweet up on the slide because I think it captures a very common impulse and emotion that people have. Anyone here who has ever who has kids who are teenagers or has ever been a teacher or a camp counselor knows that telling someone to calm down or telling someone to be patient often has a backfire effect. So we want to give people reason to be calm rather than say, calm down. There are some proof points here and talking points that will help people feel calm and patient. One is that record turnout. And this is something that is safe to say from a 501c3 standpoint, as is every message we put on here. We can talk about record turnout being a sign that democracy is functioning without having to get into what it means for either party. It is an absolutely good thing for democracy that 2 out of 3 eligible voters in this country turned out. Aside from record turnout, another proof point is that certified local election officials are working to count every vote right now, and the will of the people is becoming clearer. That term that I've said a few times already, certified local election officials, that's something to say over and over. These are the folks who are doing the work. These are the folks that people trust. Rachel, next slide, please. A couple of do's and don'ts. We want to talk about what we're for, especially when we're leading, rather than talking about what we're against. We want to frame the process of counting every vote as fundamentally about democracy and the democratic process and the voter, the will of the voter being done. This is a moral issue in and of itself. What we don't want to do is frame the counting as fundamentally about a specific outcome. In order to bring the whole country together and people on all sides into a new safe moment where we can move forward, it really needs to be inclusive of people who voted in various different ways. And lastly, we want to strive for clarity and simplicity rather than for nuance. And in this moment, that means trying to project that simple confidence and speaking from our unique perspective as faith leaders and not trying to sound like an election law expert or a pundit who knows the map and exactly what day the race is going to be called or anything like that. We want to strive for that clarity and simplicity, not the nuance and expertise. Rachel, next slide, please. So I heard that there's a loud clicking noise. Okay, let me know if, I don't think that's on my end. So moral messaging. I said earlier, we should be speaking from a moral perspective. We put this slide with this message up on here because it shows how to use moral language and invoke moral principles in a way that's consistent throughout what we say. As people of faith, we believe every person's inherent dignity entitles them to a say in our democracy. Every vote is sacred. Americans have turned out in record numbers, and we're committed to making sure every eligible voter is counted, no matter how long it takes. Certified local election officials are fulfilling their responsibility to count every vote. Whether you're Black, brown, Native, Asian, or white, we all have a right to be counted. It's time that we come together to make this a democracy and a nation of justice for all, where everyone can thrive. Every bolded term on this slide is a moral value. I encourage everyone to speak morally. Rachel, next slide, please. All right, so I mentioned at the top that we were going to talk a little bit about a formula. And by a formula, I mean a sequence of our message that is shown to be really clear, really memorable, and really persuasive. That formula is values at the beginning, then project confidence, explain the process, and close with a call to action. Rachel, next slide, please. So leading with values, first thing you say, whether it's in a media interview or a conversation or a sermon, we want to lead with values. And that means getting your unique voice out there and invoking those moral principles. Here's an example of what it looks like to lead with values. As a faith leader, I believe every person's inherent dignity entitles them to a say in our democracy. Counting every vote is a matter of justice. It's a moral issue. Next slide, please. After we lead with values, the way to project confidence is by talking about that record turnout. I'm so grateful for the perseverance of voters this week. A record number of Americans cast their ballots despite COVID and barriers to voting, like day-long lines, removal of drop boxes, which disproportionately impact voters of color. Once every vote is counted, the will of the people will prevail. Oh, and we will be taking questions here. I see some people asking in the chat. We'll have plenty of time for that once we get through a few more. Third, help people understand the process. We want to give people information so that they can understand why it's taking longer than just one night to get the entire count done. This election had record turnout and possibly more, and actually it's no longer possibly more absentee ballots. It is more absentee ballots than ever before because of COVID. When certified election officials take the time to verify and count every ballot, that's a sign that our democracy is working. So not having results right away makes sense. And while we wait, we need to do our part by demanding that all of our neighbors' votes are counted. Next slide, please. And then closing with a call to action, which we're going to do today. After you've laid out the moral values at stake, laid the groundwork for confidence, and explained the count, we want to give people an action that they can take very soon in order to feel empowered, in order to feel part of the process. I know we got a lot of community organizers on the call based on some of the familiar names I saw dropping in the chat right away. And that principle of giving people something to do at the end holds up true with this messaging. Rachel, next slide, please. So that's a brief and I hope simple overview of messaging that is 501c3 appropriate, nonpartisan appropriate, that helps people feel confident. Now, before we get to Q&A, I want to go through a couple of best practices, rules of thumb, rules of the road around communicating your message with clarity across different contexts and audiences. All right. So the first is to mind your audience and your context. You know, whether you're focusing on people who are watching the news, or whether you're focusing on the people who are in a room in front of you. These are, you know, you're going to have a little bit of different techniques depending on what your primary purpose and audience and context is. Next slide, please. So just wanted to lay out some of the differences in between different forums, whether you're in a sermon or whether you're speaking at a podium for a press conference, or you're in a one-on-one shorter interview with a reporter. Okay, can folks hear me? Can I get a thumbs up to see if I'm audible? Okay. The key differences here, if you're giving a sermon, you have a little bit of extended period of time, different traditions, you do have, there's different expectations, but it is more extended. In a press conference, remarks generally last about 2 to 5 minutes, and in an interview, you're looking at pretty quick sound bites, and you might get cut off. So as you're thinking of messages, as you're thinking of like how long your message is going to be, recognize these different limitations. Your audiences are different depending on your forum as well. The key here is really whether you're prioritizing the people who are right in front of you in physical proximity, or you're speaking to the news outlet. And lastly, the theological level. The shorter the forum and the more secular the forum, the more simple it's got to be. If you're speaking at a press conference, you want to use really widely known stories from your tradition and commonly known symbols. And if you're in a short interview, just really base level, universally recognized references. Next slide, please. And then just a couple more things. This is how to prepare for an interview and to do well in an interview. First, to be yourself, to remember your unique voice and bring your personality into the conversation. Two is that how you look and how you sound matter just as much, if not more, unfortunately, than your than the meaning of your words. So if you're a clergy leader, wearing clothes that convey that status is important. I'm a Lutheran Christian, and I saw there are a couple other ELCA folks on here. I would wear, if I was a Lutheran pastor, I would be sure to wear that white collar. And for whatever your tradition is, like whatever the garb or signifier is, you should definitely wear it. You want to talk a little lower and a little slower than you would in normal everyday conversation when you're in an interview. And reporters, keep in mind, are only going to use a small portion of your remarks or your interview in that final story. If you're speaking at a press conference, there might be a 10-second segment of your remarks that makes it onto the evening news. If you're in a radio interview, you might get a 7-second quote just as likely as you would get the full conversation. So with those limitations in mind, it's a good idea to lead with your very best soundbite. The thing that you most want to see quoted in the paper or on the news, say that first. And remember that an interview is an opportunity to deliver a message. It's not a conversation. If you go in with that mindset, it'll help you be really crisp with your sound bites. And make sure to keep it short and stick to the plan. Because improvising or going on beyond your plan can lead to accidents. Next slide, please. And lastly, if you have a chance to tell a personal story that's relevant, whether that's in front of a congregation or in front of an interviewer, make sure that your story is really easy to follow. And that means it has a beginning, followed by a middle, followed by an end. We avoid things like flashbacks and asides and tangents. We want to keep it really simple. And by that, I mean the essential details only and avoiding jargon, abbreviations, lingo, things like that. Like for instance, I would definitely say Board of Elections rather than BOE if I was telling a story. And we also want to omit negative information about the side about the view that we're trying to portray. I've seen people sort of disclose sort of self-undermining information in stories before, so I always like to remind folks to avoid doing that. And that is these are really the essentials of media, of storytelling, and of messaging. So with that, I'll step back and we'll have time for questions at the end.